If you do want to innovate, your CEO needs to spend at least 40% of their time on innovation.
For many large corporations, innovation has become a big challenge.
As business models and value propositions expire faster than ever before, you actually need to rejuvenate that entrepreneurial part. And that's what's key to stay alive. Any innovation, but also any startup, starts with an idea. And then you kind of try to figure out, how do we go from idea to value propositions that customers care about and a business model that can scale? And if you found that, you start and execute, scale it, and then manage it.
You don't have to work in an agile manner throughout the organization. You just need to build up that capability for all of those uncertain areas.
So you don't wake up in the morning and become a Roger Federer just because you decided, to play tennis.
We have to talk about failure.
Does it need to be an entrepreneur at the head of the company that can innovate? Hiring great innovators is not going to turn your company into an innovation engine. So innovators cannot innovate in a company without collaborating with the core business. You need to flip a switch in your head and say, okay, now the questions are very different. We can't plan innovation. The world is not going to adapt to, kind of bend to our ideas. Anybody can be an entrepreneur. Anybody can start something, and anybody can compete to become the CEO of a micro enterprise.
Welcome everyone to our next edition of the Agile Insights Conversation Series. Today I'm hosting a good mentor, friend, and collaborator, Alex Osterwalder. He was one of the first presenters we had back then as part of our Agile 100 online conference. And Alex and I are going to dive into several topics today, among them, or the most important one, being corporate innovation, which has been his focus or his area of focus for the past, I think, 2 decades, more or less. And I'm super excited to have you with us, Alex. Thanks for taking the time.
Pleasure to be here. Always good conversations with you.
Thank you. So, Alex, I assume a lot of people already know you, but I don't want to make the assumption that all of our audience knows you. So let's just quickly start with a brief introduction of who you are, what you've been doing, and then I'll dive into the topics that I want to cover with you today.
Okay. So you want me to talk about who I am?
Well, yes. Look, talk about yourself, Alex. Go ahead.
I'll keep it simple. So, creator of the Business Model Canvas, founder of Strategyzer. You see a couple of books behind me. Really focusing on innovation for the last 2 decades, working a lot with Yves Pigneur. But now we have with Strategyzer a team around the world, and we help large corporations innovate. So build innovation engines into the DNA of their company.
Yeah, into the DNA of companies that at some point probably were innovative, because otherwise they wouldn't have become that large. But at some point also lost that innovative edge. And you pointed out the books. All of those books, I can say it already, are highly recommended from my end. Whenever I teach courses for agile leaders or product owners, I always recommend people to take a stab at those books. The tools are priceless. Now, Alex, let's get into the topic of corporate innovation. Now, you've been focusing on this for the past 2 decades, as you mentioned. And I want to start with the questions, where have you seen, or what have you seen being the biggest challenges for organizations to constantly innovate? I mean, that's not a challenge for every organization, because we have the Apples, the Amazons, and some other companies out there. But for many large corporations, innovation has become a big challenge. And I want to explore with you why this is the case.
Yeah, and I'd even say that those that are good can get better at it, right? With very few exceptions. And I'll actually just quickly, put up a slide on this and then go through the idea here. So, any innovation, but also any startup, starts with an idea. And then you kind of try to figure out, how do we go from idea to value propositions that customers care about and a business model that can scale? And if you found that, you start and execute, scale it, and then manage it. So the challenge here is that both worlds are very different, right? The search world, innovation and entrepreneurship, they're very messy. There's a lot of uncertainty. You manage this in a different way than the scaling and managing of a company. So what you end up is this, this what we call explore, exploit continuum. So every company was a startup at one point, But the bigger you get, the more you really focus on managing the existing, which we call exploit. The problem is when you apply those KPIs, those metrics, the culture, the processes to exploration, you actually kill exploration. So while every company, was a startup and innovative, they gradually grow out of that. Now, the challenge is that because business models and value propositions expire faster than ever before, you actually need to rejuvenate that entrepreneurial part. And that's what's key to stay alive. So innovation is not kind of an event. It's an ongoing thing where you have these two cultures, exploit and explore, that need to live in harmony, which sounds trivial, but they're often actually more kind of clashing rather than living in harmony. That's the biggest challenge. So the number one challenge is that there are these two different cultures, and we need to lead those two different cultures in harmony under one roof. That's not yet really done well in most organizations.
Yeah, and I think it's not done well because it's not that trivial, right? It might sound simple from a method, like from a theoretical perspective, but having that in place at the same time, and you mentioned those cultures living in harmony, that makes it difficult. Now, and this
let me just emphasize something.
Go ahead.
Sorry if I'm cutting you off, but the explore exploit drawing is very simple. Yet in every conversation I have with senior executives and board members, I always start with that drawing. And I usually draw it on a flip chart, right? And why? Because while it's so simple, in people's minds, these two worlds do not yet exist as separate entities. And that, it's actually not two worlds in an org chart kind of sense, but it's in your head. As a leader, in the morning, you might be working on a supply chain project. You have an execution mindset. We plan analytically and we execute. And then, an hour later, you're in a meeting with an innovation team. You need to flip a switch in your head and say, okay, now the questions are very different. We can't plan innovation. The world is not going to adapt to, kind of bend to our ideas. So you need to ask, what are we learning? What's the evidence? How many times have you iterated? Should we kill this project or should we continue to invest? So that's the fundamental thing. So you always need to go back to the fundamental basics, explore, exploit. And every leader needs to ask in every instance, am I in a certain context with high certainty? Then I plan and execute and think analytically. Am I in a high uncertain environment? Planning doesn't make sense. It's experimentation, right? So this very simple rule, are we an explore or exploit, is very powerful. And leaders start to understand, I need to flip this switch, right? That's not yet the case. This awareness that I need to behave differently in both different contexts.
Yeah. No, and I fully agree with this. This is one of the key messages. I sometimes draw explore, exploit. Usually I draw something which is referred to as the Stacy diagram, where you have different domains of work, which is, again, based on what uncertainty and how uncertainty. And what I always tell organizations, you don't have to work in an agile manner throughout the organization. You just need to build up that capability for all of those uncertain areas, which is all of those innovation periods, right, where you constantly have to iterate, where you have to inspect and adapt to identify what's working. Now, beyond this mindset thing, right, where you mentioned, like, you have to flip this switch in your head.
Yeah.
What other challenges do you see before we go into looking at some patterns that can help us be successful?
Yeah, I'd say the number one thing is that in many organizations, I don't want to generalize, all of them, but in many organizations, we have managerial CEOs who don't see it as their task to spend time on innovation. Yet, if the CEO, the leader, doesn't spend time on innovation, they're sending a very strong symbolic message to the rest of the company. Well, the leader's not doing it, so it's not important, right? So if you do want to innovate, your CEO needs to spend at least 40% of their time on innovation. That's 2 days, right? And not that many companies are doing that. Now, I have, currently a favorite, two really favorite CEOs. One is Bracken Darrell of Logitech. He spends 40 to 60% of his time on innovation. And the other one is Jessica Tang of Ping An, who's actually co-CEO, who spends 100% of her time on innovation. So you will not get innovation at scale in your company when the leader doesn't spend at least 40% of their time on innovation. So that's number one. That's the number one thing. Everything else becomes easier and feasible because we actually know how to do innovation. It's not, it's hard, but it's not technically hard. We know how to do it with the leadership commitment. And that starts with the number one, it is possible. Without the leadership commitment, it's, I'd say, impossible. So I like to say, CEO doesn't spend, 40% of their time on innovation. Not going to work. I call it the Rita McGrath test, or
I was just going to go there.
Yeah, she says, look at the CEO's agenda, literally go into the calendar and look at how much time is carved out for that. Of course, there's a whole conversation, but what does that actually mean? What does the CEO do those 2 days, right? But if that time is not carved out, the symbolic message to the company is innovation is not important.
Yeah. And you mentioned two CEOs, one of Logitech, the other from Ping An, which is great because those are, Logitech quite well known, Ping An maybe not so well known in the Western hemisphere, in the Western world, but they are big corporations. They're not like small, tiny startups where it is the natural job of the CEO working so much or of spending that much of their time on innovation. And we've had other CEOs doing the same thing, right? Steve Jobs was famous for being part of those big innovative projects. Jeff Bezos always refers to, he's working on some quarter in the next 3, 4, 5 years, which basically means he's working on the future of the organization on innovation and not that much time on the execution of the daily business. So,
but here's the thing, right? You were mentioning two entrepreneurs, and for a very long time, I was asking myself, does it need to be an entrepreneur at the head of the company that can innovate? And if you take, that's why I use counterexamples. It's always, when we refer to Amazon, look, they had innovation in their DNA. What's more interesting is to take a company like Logitech or Ping An. They had to transform to reinfuse, in the case of Logitech, innovation back and entrepreneurial spirit back into the company. And in the case of Ping An, they had to transform to become an internet company and grow from the top 500 companies in the world into the top 20 companies in the world. And both of those people, Bracken Darrell was not an entrepreneur. He was actually a manager at Procter & Gamble, but he's an entrepreneurial CEO. So he, doesn't have the track record of having started from scratch and built a business. So it shows it's possible. And Jessica Tan was actually a McKinsey consultant. So we can always make back jokes, right? But she's brilliant and understands the entrepreneurial mindset. So what we need to understand today is, yes, some companies that stay entrepreneurial, it's because the leader was an entrepreneur and built the company from scratch. But it is possible today to hire entrepreneurial CEOs who will infuse innovation and entrepreneurship into the company. And that's the role of the board of directors, right? So I actually think, CEOs are not the leaders, if you want. They're hired by the board of directors. So to execute an entrepreneurial vision and strategy. So the real role here is to educate board of directors so that we can have entrepreneurial CEOs who can spend 40% of their time on innovation. Without the board support, so the owners of the company, public or private, you won't get that. And we're talking about large companies. It doesn't have to be large companies. For smaller companies, it's actually a matter of survival. So, and usually it's easier. The smaller the company, the easier, because the CEO, sometimes the owner, can make it happen. In large companies, it's much harder. We always think it's easier in large companies. Way harder. In smaller companies, innovation is a matter of survival and it's easier to pull off.
Yeah, I think you brought up a very, very important point because I've had that question for myself as well. If we look at some of the bigger organizations like Starbucks, whenever they lose their innovative edge, who do they bring back? The initial founder, right? So the founder CEO, who was the entrepreneur. But the cases that you brought up, I think, are so important for many organizations because they cannot bring back the founder. The founder died 100 years ago in some cases. So they have to figure out a different way of bringing in an entrepreneurial CEO to secure the longevity of that organization. And I think that's a very important point. And I like the examples.
Yeah. So in the case I gave you, the founders are still alive, right? So at Logitech, the founders still on the board, and the board hired Bracken Darrell explicitly to reinfuse an entrepreneurial spirit. At Ping An, Peter Ma was the founder and is today the chairman. He wanted to bring in the entrepreneurial spirit and actually experiment a lot, so he hired Jessica Tan. So in those two cases, we still have the entrepreneur at the board level, right, coming in. So, and that shows the importance of the board. So and this is a transition that's happening today. I just actually talked to a group of Swiss board members. I was invited by Swiss VR, the Association for Swiss Board Members, and there needs to be much more education about innovation at that level, because there are tons of myths. We say, innovation, we think technology, it's R&D. It's not, right? It can use technology, it doesn't have to. We think innovation is expensive. Well, if you do it wrong, correct, because you're going to waste a lot of money. Innovation in the early stage is actually very cheap because you make small bets. So there are many, many myths, not just at the senior executive level, but in particular at the board level. So if we educate boards, that's when we're going to be able to turn around the Nestle's of the world. Because in those cases, indeed, the founders, that was over 150 years ago, they're dead. So it might be something there that the ones that really innovate at scale still have founders in the board, and those that can't yet. But again, we probably need to do some research on that.
Yeah. No, but that's interesting. So we're already moving towards like some success story. You mentioned Logitech, you mentioned Ping An. And in addition to like the board bringing in an entrepreneurial CEO, I'd like to explore with you a few other patterns that you've seen then evolve in these organizations as part of the work that this entrepreneurial CEO, or maybe also other people, do. What do you see as great patterns for success in organizations that manage to consistently innovate despite being large corporations?
Yeah, I'd say that the key one is to understand that in innovation, you can't pick the winners. So you actually need to invest in a portfolio, a large portfolio of ideas. And I'll quickly draw that because, fun to use a slightly different sport here. So, when you have, let's say, a team, let's see if we can make this work here. A team with an idea, they want to focus on innovation. They go from idea to real business. Let's keep it small and call it a $10 million success. Well, that's a pretty messy process. And if as a company, you invest in one team, what you just did is you condemned this team to succeed. Because if there's only one project, they have to succeed, right? So, because otherwise you won't have innovation. And what are they going to do? They're going to play it safe. You condemn the team to succeed. So in exploration, you can't treat it as one project, one investment, one success. That's in execution, building a new supply chain, new factory. That's how it works. But in innovation, you actually need to invest in multiple teams and ideas. Let's keep it, relatively manageable. Let's say 10. But here's the thing. You will allow 10 teams to start. You give them a small budget, okay? Just a small budget and a little bit of time. But let's say after 12 weeks, you decide which one of these teams get follow-up investments and which one of these teams are going to successfully retire, right? Because it's not failure. They explored, they had no evidence. So then, ideally, you only invest in 25% of teams and projects and ideas, and you successfully retire. I'm deliberately not calling fail, right? You successfully retire 75% of projects, right, that you take away. And then after here, you maybe give 6 months, okay? You invest in 1 or 2. And the point here is that the teams need to go into the market and get evidence. And then you'll make evidence-based investment at each stage here. That's how innovation works. You can't pick the winner. You actually invest in many small ideas, get teams to test, come up with evidence. That is the hardest part for companies. Why? Because it's a different mindset. we can't pick the winner. This is not about execution. We need to retire projects. Isn't that failure? Aren't we wasting money? No, that's exactly how innovation works. And if you're a large company, you'd need to do this with 2,000 projects. And if you're a small company, you'll do it with 3. But it's the same logic, large or small. You take this mindset from the entrepreneurship world and venture capital world, and you bring it inside to your corporation. And when you're large, you're going to do that inside, plus doing a corporate venture capital kind of thing, plus doing mergers and acquisitions, right? When you're smaller, you're probably going to go for the homegrown approach.
Yeah. And I remember you shared this as part of the boot camp that I visited. I think it's already like 3-4 years ago.
Many years ago already. Yeah.
It's been such a long time.
Time flies.
Yeah, COVID messed up everything. but back then you asked this question, right? How many companies do we have to invest in to get a unicorn exit, right? And that's just 1 billion. 1 billion, right? Many organizations are looking, especially big corporations, need bigger business models than that. And the number was 250 or something like that from the venture capital world.
Yes.
Now, my question would be...
And that's just valuation, right? So that's just valuation. So when you look at early stage venture capital, you need to invest in 250 projects statistically to get one, outsized return. And that's 50x times the capital. But that's just valuation. That's not even revenue. So in corporations where we really need to work fast towards revenue, probably, I would say 1 in 2,500. And that's very early stage. And, what you need to do in corporations is mainly try and learn, but you have the budget maybe then to say, okay, we learned what works. We know where the world is going. Now let's make an acquisition. Because you can't do everything inside your company because it's very slow. But the best companies have this mix. So some things they do with investments, like a venture capitalist, corporate venture capital. Some things they do internally, they experiment and they say, we're going to keep this in-house because there's nothing out there, we're going to grow this. And sometimes they say, we learned this, but there's already a competitor out there, we actually just need to acquire, right? So it's a whole toolbox that when you get good at innovation, you're going to integrate this. And most companies, larger ones, have all of this, but it's completely separated, right? There's not one strategy that informs how we're going to manage the company and how we're going to invent the future. And they don't orchestrate corporate venture capital, the whole kind of innovation funnel inside the accelerator programs and the mergers and acquisitions. Yet it should be one strategy. And that's what the great ones like Ping An actually do.
Yeah. Now, another point that I wanted to talk about as part of this, you emphasized several times on successfully retiring those projects and not calling them failures. I also remember we had conversations about this in the past where you said, man, we have to talk about failure, right? We have to address the elephant in the room. But I assume that you would use the term failure in maybe different areas and not when you retire projects.
Correct. So you experiment and fail. And then sometimes people say, yeah, but Alex, call it learning. No, it's not learning. You actually fail. You came up with a concept that no customer cares about. That's failure. And then you learn, but even learning and, failure's never the goal. Learning is not the goal either. The goal is to actually make a decision and then either pivot into a new idea or project, new value proposition or business model, or kill the project, right? So I do use, at the beginning, I think successfully retired is when you don't have this culture yet. But over time, you do call it failure. So guess why Jeff Bezos, used to say, we're the best company in the world to fail. Because he wants people to understand that exploring bold new ideas is not a career risk. And in most companies, you cannot fail. You cannot fail because you're going to risk your career. So innovation is not a career path. Innovation is career suicide. So we do need to make people comfortable with experimentation. And when you experiment, the likelihood of failure, the bigger, the bolder the idea, the likelihood of failure gets larger, right? So you need to get comfortable with this kind of failure. And of course, Jeff Bezos didn't mean you failed building a new warehouse because that's the stuff that gets you fired. It's this kind of failure from experimenting with new ideas, right? So I do believe we need to get comfortable with failure, managing this, but actually it's the experimentation part, but failure is inevitable when it's innovation. If you know it's going to work, it's not innovation. But then when we start to make investments, we don't need to call that failure. The team explored and they successfully killed it because they knew there's nothing there, right? But in the experiment, you'll definitely fail. But when you make a decision, that's not a failure. That's actually an evidence-based decision to kill a project. And yeah, we spent, whatever, 100,000, a million, 5 million on this project. And that's okay, because that's the cost of innovating. You will invest in, if we want to be bold, the losers. But the difference with venture capital and entrepreneurship is you can have corporate innovators who try again, and then the fifth time they will succeed.
Yeah. And I think another point that is important to also mention, you said you move 40% of the projects, right, from one stage to the next stage, and then maybe 25 to the next stage. It doesn't have to be that number, right? Each of those projects that gets advanced from one stage to the next, just to make sure that our audience gets this,
yes,
needs to demonstrate the evidence so that they can move from one stage to the next stage and get the next round of funding similar to every startup if they want more VC money.
Yes. Yet, I would insist on having let me be a little bit provocative here, a strong kill rate, a healthy kill rate. Because again, if you say, no, all teams have evidence, we're going to give everybody, money, again, you're creating this pressure to succeed. You condemn the teams to succeed. If you kill projects and make that, normal, they know we can explore something bold. And even if it doesn't work and we don't get follow-up investment, we haven't tarnished our reputation and we didn't take a hit on our career. So I would say if you have 10 teams that have, all have evidence, you still only pick, I'd say maximum 5, even better, you pick 3, because you need to create a healthy kill rate. And here's why. Because you have capital and you need to allocate capital to the best ideas. If you explore all 10, here's what's going to happen. You condemn the teams to succeed, and you will have a lot of money going in all corners and directions. So no, you need to allocate capital to the very best ideas and teams. So it's not enough to just make evidence-based investments. You also need to have a healthy kill rate, because otherwise you're not allocating capital well. So it's extremely important. It's just like in venture capital. They know that they're going to have 2 or 3 that are going to return the whole fund. It's the same thing here. There's no chance on earth you're going to have 10 winners. That doesn't happen. Even the smartest people in the world, that's not going to happen. Are they going to find some evidence? For sure. But you need to allocate to the most promising ideas and teams.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that part. And actually my emphasis was, once you have that kill rate, you might even be lower than that, right? So you don't have to advance 3 or 5. Maybe you just advance 2 or 1 because the others just lack the evidence. And then you double down on that one. And even if you advance that one, doesn't mean that you take it the whole way, because at some later point in time, you might realize, nope, it's not there. Right?
Correct. And there's an important thing to add. The bolder the innovation, the likelier you're going to have to actually, have a large funnel and you're going to kill a lot of projects. If you're in very incremental innovation, we're creating a new app for the Salesforce, of course, you're not going to have 10 teams running in parallel, right? That's incremental innovation. So uncertainty is lower. So the way you want to look at it is the bigger the success must be. So if you're in a large company, 10 million is not going to move the needle. You need 100 million or $1 billion business. And if that needs to be a bold innovation, then the funnel needs to be larger, right? So the numbers need to be calibrated based on the success you're looking for and the type of innovation you're investing in. So we now know how to do that. I mean, it's not an exact science, but again, incremental innovation, it's, pretty straightforward. It's almost an execution project. Building new business models, no chance you're going to pick the winner on day one.
Yeah. And I think Big Pharma has showed this for many decades. right? If you look at the number of like molecules that they look at until they get to a blockbuster drug, it's hundreds, if not thousands of them
Yes.
that make it then through all of these stages. Then you have one blockbuster drug.
Yes.
Now,
But that's the
moving from
paradox. That's the paradox, because they're good at that for science and they're really bad at that for business models, right? And value propositions.
Yes.
So, and it's interesting, right? It's in their DNA to find new molecules, new drugs, and they're willing to invest literally billions in failures because very few are going to work. But they were never able to take that mindset of the portfolio and the funnel and bring it into business. Now, the reason why they're doing it now, we work with 5 of the top 10 pharma companies on the planet, is because they have to. And here's the thing, this is happening in a lot of industries. You know, think of it this way. If you've been earning money for 20 years because you've been selling a drug to a patient to keep the patient alive for 20 years, 2 decades, maybe even more, that's a lot of money. That adds up. And now you just found a one cure kind of injection that heals the patient. Are you going to be able to take those 20 years of revenue that you're killing and price that one cure injection at 10 million? Of course not, because the public is going to be a huge outcry. So now you have an ethical challenge and a business model challenge. If you want to bring that drug to the market, you have to find new models, new business models to price that drug, because otherwise you're committing career suicide and you're killing your revenue streams. And that's exactly what happened to Kodak. They helped invent the digital camera. That was innovation suicide. The technology killed the revenue streams. So today in the pharmaceutical industry, you have this challenge that we're undermining the current business model with new innovations. And to be less dramatic, we can take the same in the sector, you know, of you know, Pirelli, Michelin. They're putting wheels on our cars. Guess what? If you make something that you never have to replace, you just committed innovation suicide. You're going to sell your product once, people never come back. What do you have to do? You have to come up with a different business model than selling your tires, right? So super important that today to understand technology innovation and product innovation is not enough. And sometimes it kills your business model. So you have to, you're obliged to come up with new business models. And that requires a completely different innovation approach.
Yeah, I love that piece, Alex. Now, we talked about some of these patterns. A lot of these patterns ultimately go back to the people, be it the boards of directors, the entrepreneurial CEO, but also all of those people in those innovation teams. And there is a big debate out there, right? Is innovation the job of everyone? Or is it the job of a few? I assume I know on which part of this extreme you are, because we've had some conversations around this, but share your perspective with us, right?
Yeah,
Who do you want to innovate?
Yeah, there are 2 topics there. So the first one is that sometimes I hear leaders say, I remember having a very lively debate with a CEO on stage at a big conference at the Nordic Business Forum, where he was saying, oh, it's all about people. You just hire the right people and the company will innovate. And I said, well, I actually agree and disagree with that statement, because if you have a system that blocks innovators, you can have the best people on the planet. They're not going to innovate because you're not making their lives easy. Again, it comes back to this idea that managing a business and exploring the future are fundamentally different professions. So just hiring great innovators is not going to turn your company into an innovation engine. However, if you create the right system, you will unleash the innovation potential of your company. So yes, you need innovation talent, but without the right system, you're not going to be able to innovate. So yes, you need the right people, but the right people without the right system, with the right culture, they're not going to innovate. So it's yes and no, right? That's the first challenge. The other challenge is, and this one, I'll frame it in a slightly different way. Just this year, I gave a little dinner presentation in a wonderful, luxury hotel with a senior executive team of a large company, a media company. And I was drawing on the flip chart and, about innovation. And the CEO at the end says, I really get it. We need to infect everybody in the company with the innovation virus. And I was listening, I thought, I'm not so sure that's the right way to frame it. And I said, hey, I wouldn't say it that way, because you already have the innovation talent in your company. They're in the starting blocks with the right ideas. What you need to do is not infect anybody with anything. What you really need to do is create a transparent innovation system where you take away all of the blockers that are holding innovators back from innovating. And if you have that transparent system and innovators know where to go, guess what? Innovators will innovate. And I actually fundamentally changed my opinion on that, in the sense that, I was always talking about the system and all that, but actually it's about the transparency of the system. When you create that, innovators will innovate. And you need to run a core business at the same time. So let those who are comfortable with execution, are world class at it, let them be great executors. They need to run the supply chain. But then the last piece here is back to the mindset. So innovators cannot innovate in a company without collaborating with the core business. So think of it, otherwise it's just a startup in chains. A corporate venture, the only thing that they have over startups is that you have customers in an established company, you have a brand, you often have intellectual property, you have channels to the customers. If you don't have access to those, then you're just a startup in chains. So what you need is leaders in the core business who are able to flip that switch, right? So you need the entrepreneurial CFO who knows how to invest into corporate ventures. You need the entrepreneurial CHRO, the Chief Human Resource Officer, who knows that we need to acquire innovation talent. You need the entrepreneurial Chief Marketing Officer, because you need to be able to access the brand. You need the you need an entrepreneurial Chief Legal Officer, because when you run experiments, you often need to, as an established company, create the legal context so you're not breaking the law. I mean, in pharma and banking, that's a no-brainer, but even there, they don't have lawyers dedicated to innovation yet, or not at scale like they should. So you need all of these components, entrepreneurial leaders in the core business that can flip this switch. So if you put those things together, that's when you get an entrepreneurial organization.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned several times the innovators. In the past, and me being a medical doctor, I was always drawn to this analogy that you used. You talked about innovation surgeons. And you and I had this conversation several times. Why do we refer to them as innovation surgeons? It's because they do bring a certain passion for innovation, like a surgeon does for operations, but they also build the skill set for innovation over a longer period of time. It takes, I know that from my own experience, 16 to 20 years to become a world-class surgeon. I did not go down that route, right? Because it takes so long, and I had other interests, but I have seen people doing that. Do you still believe that there are, and let's call it a selected few, that can become these innovators or these innovation surgeons? Or do you think that, no, maybe that's overrated and we're going to have a larger number of people that can become great innovators?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, because I just had that at this recent event that I was doing with board of directors. And one of the participants was saying, but Alex, take Hayek, the father Hayek, who actually invented the Swatch brand and turned around the entire Swiss Swatch, the watch industry with the Swatch brand. He was a born innovator, right? And he was saying, well, we just need those, right? The problem is not everybody is a Hayek, a Steve Jobs, or Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a bit of a critical figure at the moment, so you can love him or hate him. But so not everybody has that natural kind of flair, for sure. But that's, something we can actually train. So I do believe today we know what it takes to do this more systematically, to educate people to become world-class entrepreneurs. Will they ever become, a Steve Jobs? Of course not. But can we get close to that? You bet, right? And that's where hard work and training always beats talent. So today, I think we know how to do that. And look, at the beginning, when I was starting out in this area, I was working with a lot of successful innovators one, Steve Blank has become a very good friend. He launched the whole lean startup movement. And I asked him, Steve, you've been in Silicon Valley, you've built several companies, and you've been successful. Why are you fascinated or, in love with these tools and these processes? And he was very clear. He said, I wouldn't have as many scars and I would have gone much faster. So it's not because because some people succeeded without these processes, without these tools, that we should do it now. Actually, we can unleash a lot more innovation talent and get people to become more Steve Jobs-like, right? So you don't wake up in the morning and become a Roger Federer just because you decided, to play tennis. And Roger Federer didn't start out as one of the world's best talents ever in tennis. So you have to train. And the analogy with surgeons, I like it because it's a little bit different than in sports. When you want to become a medical doctor or surgeon, there are a couple of things you need to know first. Like, number one, you really need to understand anatomy and physiology. So in business, I call it the business anatomy and physiology, business models and value propositions. Back to the basics. You need to deeply understand how every aspect of business works. But then just reading books and understanding that doesn't turn you into a great doctor or a great surgeon. So you need the internships, the experience over time to get better at it. But one without the other doesn't work, right? So sometimes we think we can train innovators and entrepreneurs just, by putting them in front of other great entrepreneurs. Like, imagine if your surgeon walks into the room and says, yeah, look, I was hanging out with a couple of world-class surgeons. That's how I learned to become a great surgeon. That doesn't work, right? So you need both. You need to understand business anatomy and physiology deeply, and you need to really acquire those skills over time and get good at it. And that does include talking to others who've done this and learned this, but you can't learn by assimilation alone. So this back and forth between, you can call it theory and practice, extremely important. And the other one is, also that entrepreneurship and innovation does, Steve Blank likes to talk about this a lot, doesn't always have this, back and forth between art and science. So to become a world-class innovator and entrepreneur, you do need to be creative and figure out new ways and see patterns that others don't see. But then you also need a very systematic approach to test and adapt your ideas. So it's not just process, it's not just learning, and it's definitely not just creativity. So we fall into these myths sometimes, and we should find ourselves between these two. And I think medical education has been, for me, a very good analogy, to explain how do you teach great entrepreneurship and innovation.
Yeah, no, I can fully agree with that. I think, and then because it takes so long to build up that skill set, it's not going to be every single person in an organization working on these big innovations. They can do those incremental innovations, right? Yeah. But these big things, you need to have that systematic approach behind it. And that requires having people gone through the education and the practice to be able to do this. So Alex,
just
go
a
ahead.
Quick challenge to that, because it's a big thing, right? So what we see often in companies, let me just get rid of all the scribbling here, is that we take people from the core business and make them innovators, and then we send them right back to the core business. What's the challenge with that? You're going to work with amateurs all the time, eternal amateurs, because you're always going to get people who do the first time and they're going to go back. This is hard. So you get better at it over time. So you need to make sure that you have at least a small group of professional innovators, professional entrepreneurs, because you get better at it over time. So at least, I usually say maybe 1% of your company need to be professional innovators. That's all they do. They need to keep the connection with the core business. And then the more an idea grows, the more you're going to bring in people from the core business or from the outside, because it requires new skills. But you cannot grow great innovation talent by picking them for 1 year. You don't become a great surgeon by just doing this for 1 year and then going back to doing something else. So we need to really, really, really train and even acquire innovation talent in companies, because you get better at it over time. And it's not black and white. You'll have some who will always do innovation. You have some who will always do execution, and you'll have teams that will grow as a mix. But you really are better off if you have entrepreneurial leaders who know how this works. So at the very least, the team, the leadership team you build around a corporate venture needs to have done this several times, because first-time entrepreneurs, they rarely succeed. The cover magazine, with the 19-year-old Stanford dropout, that's a myth. If you look at the statistics, this is good for the older people among us, the most successful entrepreneurs who build scalable businesses are over 40 years old. So the probability goes up with your experience, right? So we should get away from these myths that's all about the young, have never done anything before. That does exist. It's just the exception, right? So we need to build innovation talent, foster innovation talent inside companies. Otherwise, we're always going to have an amateurish approach, right? That doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, this is good news because I just turned 40 this year. So now statistically, I can succeed, right? That's what, but even if you look at those like Harvard dropouts, whatever, many of them had previous businesses that didn't work out. Zuckerberg was part of that group, and many of the others as well. Now, as we're approaching the end of our time box, Alex, and I want to be conscious of your time, a few final things. You emphasized on the role of the board, of senior management, right? Entrepreneurs, CEO, CFO, CHRO, all of those. But the middle level managers in organizations, what kind of role do they play in helping the organization bring back that innovation capability and succeed with it?
Yeah, I think there's something there maybe first to clarify, right? And it's back to this whole, exploit, explore. So if you say everybody needs to be an innovator in a company, then middle managers might be, the gatekeepers. But if you actually admit that in a company you will have two arenas, and you'll have some kind of, incremental innovation in exploit or some product innovation over there. That's where middle managers can unlock. But you'll also have the big breakthrough ideas over here. So I think it's this kind of, we need to get away from this thinking that middle managers are across the board. If you actually have professional innovators and you have a whole structure set up to manage that, you have no middle managers who are going to block that, because you have an ecosystem where there are no middle managers to block the innovation efforts, right? So I'd be a little bit cautious, in terms of generalizing, because if you're really good at it, there are no more middle managers in that space. You're decentralized, right? Now, in the core space, when we're talking a little bit more about incremental innovation or sustaining innovation with new products, there it's again that mindset switch, right? That we need to help people understand, when am I in an execution mindset and when am I in an exploration mindset? And we need to change their kind of, incentive system, because if you're 100% incentivized to execute, well, why would you even think about innovation? So I don't blame these people, because it's the system that turns them into what they are. So you can kind of fix that. So it's really, really important to understand different types of innovations require different organizational structures. And to put a very extreme example, take Haier, again, sorry for another Chinese example, but you do not have middle managers anymore. Like, there are no middle managers. Haier is a company that has 4,000 micro enterprises that constantly reconfigure. Anybody can be an entrepreneur. Anybody can start something, and anybody can compete to become the CEO of a micro enterprise. So they just completely eradicated this and said, okay, everybody can be an entrepreneur. We're going to build an ecosystem that's thriving with many, many little teams. When you actually build something of value, you survive. When you don't build something of value, your little micro enterprise is going to disappear, and you have to go somewhere else and find somebody who's going to pick you up. So again, there's no black and white answer to your question. It depends a bit how you build your system. And if you build it right, you're going to have world-class middle managers who help do world-class execution and enable some innovation in the core business. But that does not mean, as a CEO, for example, as a senior leadership team, you don't build another place. You need to build another place where there are no middle managers that hold back innovations, in particular around business models.
Cool. Alex, thank you so much. We're at the end of our time box. I can't tell you how grateful I am that you took this time to speak to us and share your insights with our audience. I'd love to have you back at some point. I'll reach out. I know to whom I have to reach out. And let's say thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Always a great conversation with you. Take care.